Today, I want to talk about standardized testing, specifically what it measures and what it doesn't. So, first of all, standardized testing is not evil. It's also not magic. It's essentially a tool. And like most tools, it can be useful. That is, right up until we use the tool for the wrong thing, pretending it does more than it actually can. I've been teaching for 20 years all over the world, and I've seen testing systems from multiple angles. Different states, different countries, different frameworks. They all come with the same tension. So let's break it down. What does standardized testing really measure? The answer? It measures baseline academic performances and proficiencies. So it can be used to see if students can read at grade level, if they can perform mathematical operations, if they can interpret data, and if they can apply certain defined standards. Those things matter. As teachers, administrators, and parents, we should know if students are learning the foundational skills. This testing also creates accountability. And that's important because without measurable data, schools can hide the areas where they are failing. Let the students who struggle continue to slip through the cracks and ultimately disillusion the public about their own performance. Gaps can be ignored, and we don't want that. I've worked for underfunded school districts before where test scores exposed inequalities and people were conveniently overlooking them up until standardized test scores came in. The data forces us to pay attention, and that's not a bad thing. Of course, the next issue is that there's funding pressure. Unfortunately, for many, test scores don't just inform, they ultimately influence funding. They affect a school's public rating and they change the perception of the school. It can even get to the point where it changes the housing market around that school. So this means that it influences behavior on the parts of the people, including the parents, the teachers, the administrators. And when funding and reputation are tied to a single metric, that metric becomes as valuable as oxygen. Schools usually respond the same way as any system responds under pressure. They focus on the thing that's measured intensely and sometimes exclusively at the cost of many other valuable options. This brings us to the narrowing effect. And here's where things get complicated. If reading and math are the areas being tested, and funding depends on those scores and those scores alone, then what should principals allocate time towards? Usually, they bump up reading and math. Unfortunately, that means that other things get less. So the arts might take a hit, civics, perhaps they cancel the band or theater classes. Hands on exploration definitely takes a hit. Unstructured curiosity almost always takes a nosedive. And to be clear, it's not because the teachers or the administrators don't value them. It's just that the system only rewards what can be quantified. And in the end, if it's not on the test, it often isn't a focus. This isn't done out of malice, it's a matter of survival for many schools. And here's the quiet irony: the skills most adults say they value are often the hardest to measure. Things like critical thinking, resilience, the ability to collaborate, ethical reasoning, and curiosity. You can't bubble those things in on a sheet with a number two pencil. It doesn't work. What questions would you ask to even try? This brings me to the real learning. When we look at real learning, it's often messy. It looks like a student who's revising an essay 3 times before it's turned in. A math problem that's been solved incorrectly, possibly by more than one student, before it's done correctly and deep understanding can happen. A debate where students struggle with their emotions while laying out facts. Often their case will get intertwined in that, and hopefully some will even change their mind. A student who asks a question so out of the box, so out of nowhere, no test writers ever anticipated it. Real learning takes time, years in fact. Standardized testing is fast. It's a few hours in and out. Real learning is contextual. It needs to be adopted into the student's schema before it can be truly understood. Standardized testing, it's very uniform, it's methodical, it's black and white. Both have roles in the world of education, don't get me wrong, but it's important to understand that they are not the same. And let me be clear about something else that's important. Teachers do not wake up thinking, how can I teach to the test today? They wake up thinking, how do I get this group to understand the concepts that we're covering? Unfortunately, when the test determines funding, evaluation, and public trust, ignoring it is not an option. So, teachers are forced to walk a tightrope. They try to teach deeply, but they also prepare strategically. We do all that we can to protect curiosity, but we also have to meet our benchmarks. It's a lot, and both sides are equally important. There is one other thing I feel compelled to state. Standardized tests only measure a student's performance on a specific day at a specific time. They don't measure growth mindset. They don't measure grit, compassion, leadership, integrity, or whether a student helped a classmate understand a concept. All good things. In fact, those are the things that shape us as adults far more than percentile rankings. So, the uncomfortable question, if it can't be tested, does that mean it doesn't matter? Because if the answer is yes, then education becomes little more than a transactional process. However, if the answer is no, then we need room in the system for what cannot be easily graphed on a chart or put into a spreadsheet. As a Gen Xer, I remember standardized testing being a thing you took very rarely. In fact, I think we only had one, and it was the MCAT. Most states had a CAT of some sort test, usually around the 10th grade. But today, some schools are doing far more. In fact, I'd say there's a whole ecosystem just of testing. They have their own dashboards, they have their own data walls. They're used to create growth projects and tell teachers who they're supposed to focus on. I've worked in schools whose sole purpose was apparently to raise up the bottom 10 or maybe 20% of students, many times at the cost of neglecting the higher achievers because they knew that those students were going to pass the test no matter what. And they really wanted to get more students to pass. So they didn't focus on the higher achievers. Back in the 80s, teachers didn't talk about data-driven instruction. They certainly didn't bring up any of the standards with students. They didn't even bother writing things on the board like I can statements or today we're going to be learning about these things and here's a layout of level 1, level 2, level 3 for understanding. They just talked. We talked about whether the film strip jammed or whether anyone knew how to hook up a VCR. Those were things in the 80s. The progress, though, that isn't the problem. It's the imbalance that's the problem. So here's my best attempt at an unbiased take. Testing is necessary and accountability does matter. Equity requires measurement. But when measurement becomes the mission, the learning gets squeezed. Our goal should not be higher test scores alone. It should be higher capabilities for all. And that includes higher reasoning and, more importantly, higher humanity. Because one day, those students won't just be test takers, they'll be voters, they'll be parents raising their own kids. They'll grow up to be engineers and artists and leaders. And ultimately, despite how high schools in America run today, no one is going to hand them a Scantron sheet before asking them to solve a real world problem. So maybe a better question isn't, are standardized tests good or bad? Perhaps it's, are we using them as a flashlight to guide us or as a spotlight that blinds us to everything else? Next time, I'd like to talk to you guys about today's kids and question, are we raising fragile students? Because if testing measures knowledge and phones are reshaping attention, that conversation also deserves some honesty. Until then, ask yourself, was the last test you took as an adult or as a student? Welcome to the conversation.